rotor blades with the pilot's pedals have become disconnected. This failure would have prevented the pilot from controlling the aircraft. Well, this news comes as a memorial service is held in Guildford for the pilot, Eric Swaffer, and his co-pilot and partner, Izabela Lechowicz. Our news correspondent, Duncan Kennedy, is at the service. And, Duncan, this report would suggest that there was nothing he could have done.
Exactly, Simon. I think it is pointing to mechanical error rather than to pilot error, at least in this initial report from the Air Accident Investigation Branch, what they call a special bulletin. They get these things out very quickly after an accident to make sure other operators know what's going on and what their initial conclusions are. And as you said, there seems to be some kind of mechanical disconnect between the pedals of the pilot, Eric Swaffer, and the tail rotor blade. Now, quite clear what caused that disconnect, but this is their initial finding on this Augusta helicopter. But it will help other investigators and the team itself, the AAIB, to point the finger at the mechanical fault that caused this, rather, at the moment, on its initial conclusions, at the pilot. Now, of course, Eric Swaffer was among 5 people to die in that accident on October the 27th, his co-pilot as well, Izabela Lechowicz, also his partner in life, and 3 others, including, of course, the owner of Leicester City Football Club, Vijay Siwatananaprabha. He, of course, died in that air crash with those 4 other people, and that led to that huge outpouring of grief by Foxes fans at the stadium there in Leicester, and also, of course, in Thailand, where the family of the owner come from. So huge implications for this. Lots of people wanting to know straight away, as quickly as possible, how could this helicopter have come down next to this football stadium? And at least initially, we had the conclusion of the AAIB that it was mechanical rather than human error in this case.
Swaffer, an experienced pilot, Eric Swaffer, Duncan, and also a man described as full of life, a vivacious character.
Absolutely, and that's been reflected in this memorial service here in Guildford Cathedral behind me today. Pretty much everybody you speak to describe Eric and indeed Izabela as 2 soulmates who loved life, were incredibly friendly. They worked all around the world and had friends all around the world who've turned up to this congregation today. We think somewhere in the region of 1,000 people. They couldn't hold it in their local church in Crawley. They needed to have it in a cathedral to get everybody in. And it's not only Leicester City fans who turned up today, but also many people from the aviation industry as well. And in the past hour or so, they've been listening to hymns, music from Bach and from Elgar, also readings from family and friends. And we've also been looking at the 2 pilots' uniforms, the uniforms of Eric and Izabela that have been laid out in front of the congregation. And among that congregation, amongst the family, is the mother of Eric, who's in the congregation there today. Her name is Deborah Sutton, and speaking for the very first time since the accident in October, she told me what impact this whole incident has had on her and her family.
I just couldn't believe it, and I kept trying to ring him, and he didn't, of course he didn't answer his phone. He didn't answer his phone, and I tried to ring Izabela, and she didn't answer her phone. And I knew that at any time I got hold of him, or I tried to get hold of him, he would always respond very quickly. And when he didn't respond, I thought, this is strange. I mean, sometimes Eric couldn't respond, so Izabela would be there, and she'd respond and say, you know, we'll be in touch in, ring you in half an hour, ring you an hour or whatever. But nothing happened. And I knew, before I was told, before the police arrived, I knew what had happened. And it's left an enormous hole in our lives. An enormous hole in our lives.
Well, a very dignified and poignant interview there with Mrs. Sutton. She said this has been a tremendous impact, not only on her and her husband, but also the whole family, but that they are getting lots of support and comfort from Leicester City Football Club. They realise the extent of this story. They hadn't seen today's report, Simon, so they didn't comment on that. But I think certainly so far as fans and friends are concerned, at least it puts some answers, gives them some answers as to what happened on that day and created this tragedy not only for the families involved, but also, of course, for the club itself.
Duncan, thank you very much. Duncan Kennedy there in Guildford. Well, let's speak now to the aviation expert, David Learmonth. David, good to see you. This report would suggest mechanical rather than anything that the pilot did.
I think we've known, those of us in the industry knew right from the start that it was going to be thus. There was absolutely nothing that the pilot could have done to have prevented this, to have controlled the aircraft. Once the tail rotor mechanism was no longer working as it should, and the pilot had no control over it whatsoever. As we've seen, and anybody who's seen the video, the helicopter was doomed to spin into the ground, and that's what we saw.
And just explain, if there is no control over the rotor blade, the helicopter spins out of control.
Yes, it does. The rotor at the rear of the helicopter is intended to stop the helicopter body from rotating in the opposite direction to the main rotor, the lifting rotor. I mean, if you think about it, you know, the action and reaction idea, if you don't have anything to keep the body, the fuselage of the helicopter pointing where you want it to point, then as soon as you apply power to turn the big lifting rotor on the top, then the helicopter itself underneath it will start rotating in the opposite direction. Now, what happened was that the drive to the rotor, the actual physical drive to the rotor, kept on turning the rotor, but the thing which snapped was the control cable which went from the pilot's rudders, the rudder control, which allows the pilot to direct the helicopter in the direction he wants to. That failed. It physically failed, and the pilot suddenly had no control whatsoever of the direction in which the helicopter was pointing.
David, there was, I think, a service instruction sent out to operators of this helicopter shortly after the accident. I mean, the concern will be that this is something that will affect other aircraft. What's the likelihood of that?
It's pretty common, if something goes wrong, for everybody who's operating the same type to look into what it might have been, even when we don't really yet know. But there was you know, I think, as I said, in the industry, just looking at it, we knew that something physically had broken, and we had to find out what it was. Now, the operators of this helicopter, and possibly others, but certainly of this type, they would immediately have looked into the tail rotor control and the tail rotor drive to find out whether there was anything wrong. And as soon as the Air Accident Investigation Branch investigators a while ago found that that is indeed what had happened, although they didn't know exactly the detail of why and how, but they did know it was mechanical, they warned the industry, and the industry knew then where to start looking. This is standard procedure.
David, it's good to talk to you. David Learmonth there, joining us via Skype. Thank you very much. Just want to mention, of course, Theresa May gearing up for that daunting task of trying to sell her Brexit deal to Parliament next week. Just hearing from Michel Barnier. Now, he's been talking to a group of a committee of regional representatives in Brussels today, and he has issued a rather stark warning in not too coded language to the British. He says that if there is no treaty, there is no transition period, nor is there the basis of trust with the British that we need to build the future relationship. Of course, he's been involved in 2 years of negotiations with the British over the Brexit proposals and has been speaking at that meeting with regional representatives in Brussels. It's worth repeating that. If there is no treaty, there is no transition period, nor is there the basis of trust with the British that we need to build the future relationship. Upping the ante, I don't know if he's been trying to be helpful or not. I don't know how it'll be seen, but anyway, that's the latest coming from Brussels. We'll have more from Westminster a little later on. Now, if you got up this morning and found that your mobile phone's data wasn't working, well, you're certainly not alone. Just before 5 o'clock this morning, a massive technical fault hit the O2 network, and now millions of users around the world are without access to the internet. The network has launched an urgent investigation, but so far, no joy. O2 has 25 million customers and also provides services for other networks. It's made life difficult for all sorts of businesses, from Uber to food delivery services, anyone, frankly, who relies on an app. For them, this isn't just inconvenient, it's a big and it's a serious problem. Well, let's speak now to William Webb, who's former director for Ofcom, now a technical consultant. Thank you for coming in.
You're welcome.
This is a big deal, isn't it?
It is, yes, because so many people rely on these networks that when it goes down, it's a very major issue for so many millions of people.
I suppose the surprise is that if this happened at 5 o'clock and we've still got a problem at 3, we're talking about a serious technical problem.
It certainly is unusual for it to take this long to resolve. We don't know what the problem is as yet, but the scale of the problem, both in this country and other countries, suggests it's probably some kind of a software update that one of the suppliers to the network has issued that for some reason proved incompatible or failed. And I guess now they're going to be looking at whether they can reverse that out again or fix that. But yes, to take this long is quite unusual.
It's relatively, for those of us of a certain age, it's relatively new technology, but one assumes that it's fairly robust normally. This is going to frighten a few people.
It will, but I think the assumption of robustness is one that we should question from time to time. This is a hugely complicated computer, essentially, with a number of radio transmitters around it. And in a way, it's unsurprising given the scale of complexity and given how rapidly it changes and evolves and enhances and new features are introduced, that this sort of thing doesn't actually happen more often. And it's a testimony actually to the quality control of the networks, that by and large, they keep them running pretty well. But I think we can expect this sort of thing to happen in the future as well. It's not going to be a one-off.
The impact, and I've mentioned a few companies, one thinks of Uber and delivery services, but also the London buses use it for the arrival screens on the bus stops. There will be a moment where this is going to cost people a lot of money.
Absolutely, and it's interesting how, you mentioned the Transport for London case, these sort of networks are being used to deliver what's sometimes called Internet of Things connectivity increasingly. So actually, not only will it cause a lot of inconvenience for individuals, it will start to take down a number of different systems, like bus networks and others increasingly in the future. And we do need to look very closely at how resilient our systems are and what backups we can use when this sort of thing does actually happen.
The damage financially, well, who knows? There may be a compensation issue down the road, but reputationally, what does this do to a company like O2?
It's clearly not great to have your name plastered across the headlines, and certainly if it were to be repeated on a frequent basis, then I think that would be fairly disastrous for the reputation of a company. And what we've seen in other countries, for example, in Australia, there was one operator with a lot of problems, is it can take many, many years once the reputation takes a hit for it to recover again. It takes a long time to rebuild a reputation. Now, I don't think this one-off will be enough to cause severe problems, but they clearly don't want to repeat this kind of thing anytime in the future.
No, well, it's been, what, 10 3/4 hours now. If we're still talking about this tomorrow, there may be a wider issue.
Absolutely, yeah. That would be really serious.
Well, don't take me the wrong way. I hope we don't see you tomorrow. But anyway, William, nice to talk to you for now, William Webb. Thank you very much. Now, some of Britain's leading gambling firms have agreed to a ban on television advertising during live sports broadcasts. The group, which includes Bet365, Ladbrokes and Paddy Power, have been under pressure to act because of fears the adverts were contributing to problem gambling. The ban won't cover horse racing because of its reliance on betting. Our sports correspondent Richard Conway reports.
Think fast, act faster in play.
The worlds of betting and sport have long been intertwined, but that relationship has always been controversial. Now Britain's biggest bookmakers have agreed a whistle-to-whistle ban on TV ads around live sport, with the industry seemingly listening to public opinion and political pressure.
When adults and children now feel that they need a financial stake in the outcome of a football game to feel that they're real fans, then that's a problem. And that's what the marketing, the advertising, the bombardment of these ads has done. And I think even the gambling industry recognise that.
It will blow your mind.
This move seeks to preempt potential future legislation. Ratification and the fine details await. But Betfred, one of the companies involved in this decision, said, "We included in our last consultation to the government back in January that we supported changes to TV advertising, especially around football. The proposals are a step in the right direction." The current debate has echoes of the total ban on tobacco sponsorship in sport. Gambling companies have been increasingly minded to self-regulate, though, and promote responsible betting, something the government welcomes.
The industry is rightly coming to the table. They're seeing the fact that they are benefiting by more opportunities to be out there, but that gives them a responsibility to make sure that they're doing things the right way.
Shirt sponsorship, perimeter advertising and gambling's online presence are all unaffected under the proposals. But with over 400,000 people in the UK with identified betting problems, charities think more could be done.
I think it is important that the industry pays attention to, I think, growing public concern about the way that gambling-related marketing around sport particularly is playing out. So we're pleased that the gambling businesses are recognising this, but there's more to be done.
Now please, gamble responsibly.
Responsibility has been a buzzword in betting of late, but such as the codependence between the gambling and sports industries, the stakes are high in the quest to find the right approach. Richard Conway, BBC News.
You're watching Afternoon Live. These are our headlines. Investigators say the helicopter involved in a crash which killed the owner of Leicester City lost control after the pilot's pedals became disconnected from the tail rotor. Millions of smartphone users have lost access to data services as a result of technical problems with the O2 network. And some of Britain's leading gambling companies have agreed to a ban on television advertising during live sports broadcasts.
And in sport, the new Southampton manager Ralph Hasenhüttl has spoken for the first time. The Austrian says he wants to make his name known in the Premier League. Sexism is a problem in sport. That's according to inaugural Women's Ballon d'Or winner Ada Hegerberg, who's been speaking about the night she won the award. And 2011 winner Judd Trump is in action at the UK Snooker Championship in York. Joe Perry is fighting back. It's 3 frames all. I'll be back with more on all those stories just after 3:30.
Now, Theresa May has been talking to colleagues ahead of the Brexit withdrawal vote next Tuesday to try to address concerns over the Northern Ireland border issue. She suggested MPs could be given some role in deciding whether to activate the so-called backstop, which is designed to stop the return of a physical border on the island of Ireland. Well, let's talk to our chief political correspondent, Vicky Young. Maybe fine for her to say that, but one wonders what the EU would have to say about that.
Well, yeah, there's various issues with all of this. We don't know the full details of what they're proposing, apart from Parliament having more of a say on when we might go into that backstop arrangement. Now, there will come a point, if this withdrawal agreement goes through and if there is no trade deal in place, but we get the transition period to the end of 2020, and then there will be a decision to be made if there's still no sign of that trade deal being signed off. Have to decide whether to extend the transition period or go into the backstop. It's at that point which it seems that the Prime Minister might be suggesting Parliament could have a say, but for many Brexiteers that really is no choice at all. The idea that you effectively stay in the EU or go for a backstop, which they hate the idea of, so they don't really see that as much of a concession. And one former Cabinet Minister said to me this afternoon it was completely meaningless. So there has been a meeting of Cabinet Ministers, not the entire Cabinet, but Cabinet Ministers coming and going from Downing Street today. We're told they were discussing the meaningful vote set to take place on Tuesday next week, but there's no more details about that, apart from Downing Street reiterating that they are pushing ahead with that, even though, of course, many people feel that the Prime Minister can't win it, and even some of her senior colleagues suggesting she should pull the vote altogether. Now, that idea of a compromise, let's hear what some of the Eurosceptics have to say about that. This was one speaking in the debate a little earlier.
What I find more difficult to stomach is a backstop in which we could be permanently entrapped in suspended animation whilst and could only leave at the behest of the EU. It's like entering a contract of employment which only gives the employer the right to terminate the contract. Yeah. Now, nobody in reality would enter that with their eyes wide open. It is completely wrong.
But there are others, of course, who are supporting the Prime Minister. The very experienced Sir Nicholas Soames, who said today he was coming to the end of his parliamentary career, but he really wanted to focus people's minds on the choice that they will face next Tuesday. He said he'd been a very ardent Remainer. He's very pro-European Union, but he said he did accept the referendum result, and that's why he felt that MPs really had to think carefully about what they do next week.
But I feel very strongly that we really must not reject this agreement and thus go back to square one, which would mean perhaps another deeply divisive and very unhappy referendum. In turn, that would mean the most damaging uncertainty economically, continuing division which will inevitably threaten the jobs and lives of our constituents, and investment in our economy. And I am above all afraid earn this House the undying contempt of the British people for not having the courage and the vision to grasp this deal, however we may feel about it, in the interest of the greater good.
So not an awful lot of good news for the Prime Minister today as she continues to make the case. Maybe one tiny bit though, Simon. The Liberal Democrat MP Stephen Lloyd has resigned from the Parliamentary Liberal Democrat Party in order to vote for the Prime Minister's deal. Now he says he campaigned for Remain, but he promised his constituents that he would respect the result of the referendum and back a deal that came back from Brussels. So the Prime Minister can at least count on him.
Vicky, thank you very much. Vicky Young there. The Labour Party in Wales has elected a new leader. Mark Drakeford won a leadership vote, which means he will succeed Carwyn Jones as First Minister of Wales. Well, let's go to our Wales reporter Thomas Morgan, who's in Cardiff for us now. And I think the question many people will be asking is, who is he?
Well, that's exactly right, Simon. Well, let me tell you, Mark Drakeford has been part of Welsh politics since the start of the National Assembly for Wales. He was the senior advisor to former First Minister Rhodri Morgan and took over Rhodri Morgan's Cardiff West seat when he stood down in 2011. And by 2013, he came straight into the cabinet at senior cabinet level, taking over health responsibilities there as health minister. And most recently, he's moved on looking after the finance and local government portfolio, and most recently again taking over some Brexit responsibilities. This vote went to a second round of voting, fending off Vaughan Gething, who is the health minister, and also Baroness Elena Morgan, the Welsh language minister for Wales. And in his victory speech, Mark Drakeford did reference those politicians, those Labour politicians, the socialist politicians that had such a big impact on his career. He referenced Michael Foot and Rhodri Morgan, who he says has been a mentor to him, and he closed his speech by actually referencing Jeremy Corbyn's slogan from the last UK election, for the many, not the few. Now, there are a number of things, of course, that will be in Mark Drakeford's in tray when he no doubt takes over as First Minister, when there will be a vote in the Welsh Assembly on Wednesday where Labour have a majority there. One of them being the decision over the M4 Relief Road. A new road needs to be put in place around the city of Newport to help congestion there. But of course, he will need to unite the party in terms of its approach to Brexit as the negotiations come to a close in London and in Brussels, and make sure that Wales has some sort of relevance in those discussions.
Thomas, thank you very much. Thomas Morgan there. Two former directors of Tesco have been cleared of committing a £250 million fraud after their trial collapsed. They were accused of orchestrating a false accounting scandal which saw the supermarket chain overstate its profits 4 years ago. Chris Bush and John Schooler were charged in 2016 and had been on trial for 8 weeks. The judge said the prosecution's case was so weak the jury shouldn't have to consider it. Well, economics correspondent Andy Verity has been following this long and complex case at Southwark Crown Court and told me why it was taken to court in the first place.
This goes to September 2014, when you may remember announcing on the news, I'm sure, that bombshell that Tesco had £250 million hole in its accounts. More specifically, that they'd inflated their profits by £250 million by bringing forward income when they shouldn't have done. So, for example, they had supply contracts where suppliers so keen to be with Tesco that they're willing to pay for the privilege of supplying Tesco. That income from those suppliers was supposed to come over 5 years. They brought it forward. They pulled it forward, as they call it. They had a policy of doing that, so they recognised that income this year. It's a bit like you signing a contract with the BBC for 5 years and saying, I've taken all the income right now and putting that on your accounts. And the allegation that the SFO was making was that John Schooler and Chris Bush, these not top-ranking but senior executives, knew what was going on and knew it was wrong. But the defendant's lawyer said, Actually, there's no evidence of that. You can't prove that. And the judge agreed. They went to the appeal court yesterday, but the appeal court too agreed there simply wasn't evidence to show that they knew that anything unlawful was going on.
Andy Verity. Now it's time for a look at the weather. That is with Ben Rich.
Good afternoon. Most of us have already seen at least a little bit of rain today. As we go through tonight and tomorrow, we add some strong winds into the equation. Gales, in fact, for some. There is the potential for some travel disruption. Do stay tuned to your BBC local radio station. Now, through the late afternoon into the evening, today's rain clears away. The sky is clear for a time across Scotland, but then we see more rain pushing back in from the west, a particularly wet night across the southwest of England. That could cause some disruption, and the winds will be strengthening as well, particularly across parts of Northern Ireland and Scotland. Inland areas seeing gusts of 50 to 60 miles per hour, maybe 70 or close to 80 miles per hour for some exposed coasts. Some heavy rain with that as well. Also a soggy start down across the southeast. That rain will tend to slide through. And then for most of us, Friday will be a day of sunny spells and heavy showers. Some snow mixing in across Scotland, because things will be turning chillier as the day wears on. And it will be windy for all of us. It stays windy into the weekend.
This is BBC News, our latest headlines. A pedal fault led to the crash which killed 5 people, including the owner of Leicester City. The helicopter pilot lost control when his pedals became disconnected from the tail rotor blades. Millions of smartphone users have lost access to data services as a result of technical problems with the O2 network. The Brexit vote countdown, Philip Hammond says Theresa May's deal is the best that can be negotiated with the EU.
This deal is the best deal to exit the EU that is available or that is going to be available.
Some of Britain's leading gambling companies have agreed to a ban on television advertising during live sports broadcasts. Now we go to sport. Catherine Downs, the Southampton manager's name trips off the tongue, and what's he been saying?
Are you going to give it a crack, Simon?
No.
Ah, look, you've got harder names to say in world news, let me tell you, but it's Ralph Hasenhüttl. It's easy when you know how. Apparently it means rabbit hutch in German. I don't know if that helps you remember Hasenhüttl at all. But he's been speaking about how he's not afraid of the challenge ahead of him at Southampton. And it is quite a challenge. You'll have been sitting in the stands watching them lose 3-1 to Tottenham last night. They are third from bottom on goal difference alone, so they're in the relegation zone. They've only had 1 win so far this season, just to give you an idea about how it's going down there. A 2.5-year deal, though, he signed to try and turn it around. And speaking at his first press conference, he claims his goal is to get his name known in the Premier League and among news presenters as well, I should think, and that the history and philosophy of the club fits his nearly perfectly.
It's a big challenge for me, but it's also for me a logical next step in my career. It's my goal to get my name known here in the Premier League. I had a few successful years in Germany, and it's when I left Leipzig in summer, I was thinking about my next step.
So there he is, Ralph Hasenhüttl. Hasenhüttl, Simon.
Mr. Rabbit Hutch to you and me.
Yes, exactly.
OK. Now, this sexism row at that awards ceremony goes on.
Yeah, Ada Hegerberg, the winner of the inaugural Women's Ballon d'Or, she's again played down the fact that she was asked if she could twerk when she won the award, which was, of course, an historic moment in women's football. She's been asked about it, given a few days' reflection after the award was handed out on Monday night. But having said that, again, that she wasn't offended on the evening, she does say that sexism is a big problem in sport. French DJ Martin Solveig, who asked her to twerk, which is a provocative dance, apologised for the question. And Hegerberg says she appreciates the support of stars that came out to defend her, like Andy Murray did.
I love that Bigger Profile cares so much about this theme. It's important and it makes a difference. In this case, I wasn't offended at all. I didn't take it as a hard thing. It is an issue today, and you have to speak about it. So that's why it's cool that Bigger Profile gets into it when things like this arrive.
Meanwhile, there's bad news for West Ham striker Marko Arnautovic, who will miss the busy Christmas period. He's been ruled out for a month after suffering a hamstring injury in Tuesday's 3-1 win over Cardiff. Arnautovic has scored 5 goals in 13 league matches this season. Well, let's check in with the live action, shall we, at the Barbican Theatre in York. The UK Snooker Championships last 16 underway. Judd Trump playing Joe Perry in the last 16. The best of 11 frames there. The score there, 4 frames to 3. Judd Trump, the 2011 winner, just got his nose in front. On the other table, it's England's Martin O'Donnell against China's Ding Junhui. And Ding at the table at the moment, a 3-2 lead then for the Chinese player. Full coverage right now on BBC Two and the BBC Sport website. British bobsleigh teams will not compete at the season-opening World Cup races in Latvia this weekend because of funding cuts. The sport received more than £5 million in the run-up to the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics, but lost that after failing to win a medal. A small amount of funding has been provided to help GB compete at the World Championships in March. And finally, the referee in the Tyson Fury-Deontay Wilder draw insists his 10-second count in the final round when Fury had been knocked down wasn't too slow. The British boxer beat the count, which has been debated heavily in the days since. Jack Reese has admitted he wanted to give Fury every opportunity. He said, "I took my time, but that's not to say I stalled it, like these knuckleheads are saying." Don't get to say knuckleheads often enough in the sports news. Simon, back to you.
Oh, we do. Kate, thank you very much. You're watching Afternoon Live. Now, the intriguing story of how a Dubai princess escaped from her family and was recaptured will tonight be the subject of a BBC Two documentary. Princess Latifa, the daughter of Dubai's ruler, hasn't been seen for 9 months. Her attempt to escape in March failed when she was captured and returned to Dubai. Her family claims she is safe, but she hasn't been seen for the past 9 months. Before her disappearance, Princess Latifa recorded a video which is seen in tonight's programme, and we can have a quick look now.
Hello, my name is Latifa Al Maktoum. I was born on December 5, 1985. I have to remember to say everything, because this could be the last video I make. They will for sure try to discredit this video and say it's a lie or it's an actress or something for sure. Pretty soon I'm going to be leaving somehow, and I'm not so sure of the outcome, but I'm 99% positive it will work.
I didn't hesitate. I was like, yes, of course, that would be a great adventure for both of us to live together.
She said she preferred to be killed on the boat rather than going back to Dubai.
I can talk about a lot of things that I've seen in my life. It's not what's being portrayed by the media. There is no justice here. They don't care. Especially if you're a female, your life is so disposable. And if you are watching this video, it's not such a good thing. I'm dead, or I'm in a very, very, very bad situation.
Well, I'm pleased to say that Tina Yahainen, who's Latifa's best friend, Princess Latifa's best friend, and who you saw in that video, as you can see, she's here with me now, along with the producer of tonight's programme, Jane McMullen. Jane, I just want to pick up with those last words. I mean, what do we think has happened to her?
The answer to that is we don't know. So none of her friends have been contacted by Latifa since the 4th of March. So we don't know whether she's alive or whether she is no longer alive. The government of Dubai issued a statement yesterday saying that she is alive and with her happily with her family.
Tina, a lot of people will look at this. Here's a princess, her father, one of the most powerful men in the world. She had an amazing lifestyle, but what's the but? What made her so unhappy?
Well, obviously, if you look at the skydiving pictures, you think that her life is incredibly fun, but there is a dark side to it. She had tried to escape first time in 2002, and as a result, she spent 3.5 years in prison, and she was actually tortured. So she had a lot of restrictions put upon her in terms of curfews, places she was allowed to go.
And this was this was her family doing this?
Yes. She was not even allowed to study or go to a different emirate.
In prison, what sort of conditions that time round?
That was solitary confinement, sometimes left in dark for days, sometimes light on for days. She had nothing to wash her body. She was tortured, she was beaten up.
Jane, at a time when Dubai is selling itself globally as we've reinvented, it's a tourism attraction for many people. What does it say about what's going on there at the moment, that this happens?
Well, that's exactly why we wanted to make the film, is that we have this image of Dubai, this place, winter sun, it's a place that lots of Brits go on holiday to. It's a huge, hyper-wealthy financial hub where, you know, a lot of banking happens there, a lot of Brits work there, and we really wanted to explore this darker side to it. One of our interviewees calls it one of the most repressive, the UAE, one of the most repressive countries in the region. It's a place where, you know, the family law allows for men to lock up and beat their wives. So we wanted to explore that side of it, and obviously we have with Sheikha Latifah, we have this extraordinary 40-minute video in which she tells the entire story of her life, and yes, and then that's obviously backed up by all the friends who knew her as well.
And your evidence obviously is central to this. Just tell us about the escape attempt that ended with her recapture.
Well, basically we met early in the morning, and we drove from Dubai to Oman. It was a very risky mission. Then we took a dinghy to, obviously off the coast of Oman, about 15 miles off. We were met by Hervé Jobert, the captain of Nostromo, who basically took us with jet skis to the boat. And we spent about 8 days at sea before the attack happened. And it was a brutal military attack by both Indian and UAE military forces. There was Indian Coast Guard ships, so military vessels, airplanes, helicopters, commandos, and we were unarmed. So
how did you get out?
Sorry?
How did you get out?
Well, I was taken to UAE. So I was basically missing for about 3 weeks. And thanks to Detained in Dubai and the media pressure they managed to create, I was released.
She knew what the risks were, didn't she?
We were both aware of the risks. But because she's really my best friend and like my family, I was willing to take the risk to help her.
What does it say about Dubai's treatment of women? This is an issue about the treatment of women, isn't it?
They're trying to portray equal rights, but the reality is completely opposite. Even male guardianship still exists over there, and women can be jailed for being rape victims, because over there that means sex outside marriage.
On a personal level, I mean, you say you're her best friend.
Yes.
What sort of conditions do you think she's in right now?
I think she's probably somewhere locked up, drugged, because Latifah is a fighter. She would not give up so easily. So.
Jane, when you first heard this story, I mean, were there any feelings of, oh, this could be a bit risky in broadcasting what are quite strong allegations about how her family have treated her?
Absolutely. Well, we've had, in making this documentary, we've had 7 months of investigative journalism to stand up the allegations that Latifah makes in the video, and obviously the story that Tina and the other witnesses tell of what happened after they left and then they sailed across the Indian Ocean and were caught. So, I mean, we've spoken to friends, we've spoken to experts, I've had a whole team working on this for the 7 months, standing this up and getting to the point where we can broadcast the documentary.
Tina, what were the last things she said to you before she was taken away?
Well, the last words of Latifa were just shoot me here rather than take me back to UAE. And obviously I was paralyzed, so I couldn't say anything. When I saw her screaming and kicking and while she was being taken away, I wish I had told her something. But I was completely paralyzed.
Well, thank you so much for coming and talking about it. That's Tina Jauhiainen and Jane Merriman. And this is on at 9 o'clock tonight, BBC Two. Well, thank you very much, both of you, for coming to talk about it. Thank you. Now, hundreds of new homes have been built using weak mortar that doesn't meet recommended industry standards. That's according to an investigation for the Victoria Derbyshire programme. There have been reports of faulty properties on at least 13 estates up and down the country. The full extent of the industry-wide problem is hard to measure, though, as some homeowners have been asked to sign a gagging order to claim compensation or get the problem fixed. Reporter Jim Reid investigated.
The last year and a half has just been a living hell. I went out to put stuff in my bin in the morning, and